afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to see you all, or to notice you are there. Welcome to our Safe Distance Global Studies Colloquium Fall 2020, and we are so happy to uh, that Ann Taves joins us for a talk, and that we also are embracing another dimension as part of the global studies agenda. And in your very accomplished and wide-ranging work, you have inspired many graduate students and PhDs. Maybe some of them can join us if we are able to trace them. Very accomplished and distinguished work. Your theme and now is religion, can we view it as a worldview? Um, and that brings us, that opens many doors wide open. So I'm very glad that you join us. And on behalf of Global Studies and participants, I welcome you in this way. All right, please, please, and thanks very much for joining us. Please, would you go ahead?
Okay, well, thank you, Jan, and thank you, Brett, for inviting me. Um, I do have uh, a PowerPoint here, so I'm going to. Okay.
Visible?
Okay, it's looking right, except that you have this little extra bit up here, right? But I can't get rid of that. Is it full screen for you? Do you need me to expand it?
It's good.
Okay. And I've got my presenter notes, but they're not visible to you guys, right?
It's not.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what you have on the screen right now is the title of the talk that I promised you. But Jan didn't mention, but my title formally changed as of July 1. I'm now a research professor and professor emeritus in religious studies. And I'm also the chair of the cognitive science emphasis, graduate emphasis. So my world is shifting a little bit. And then you guys asked me to speak to you in terms of, in global studies. And so it seemed to me that this was a good point to try and frame what we've been doing. And I'm referring here to my collaborator, Egil Aspram, and what we've been doing in relation to thinking about worldviews, to frame it a little more broadly. So I don't simply want to make a case for why we should study religions as worldviews and ways of life. I've been doing that for quite a while. I've published a bunch of things on that. It'll be in the background of what I'm saying, but that's pretty accessible. What I want to do today is, and this is a kind of grandiose title, but I want to talk about worldview analysis as a tool for a variety of people, educators, researchers. I can talk about that in terms of my own experience, but something that I envision may be relevant for policymakers as well. In saying this, I don't mean to imply that religion's not important, but I want to position it as part of this larger picture and make a case for the tools that we've developing as having a much wider application than just for thinking about religions. So in talking about worldviews, I want to be clear from the outset that I know this isn't a new concept. It's widely used in ordinary conversation. It turns up in journalism all the time. And there's a long history of academic discussion in philosophy, sociology, religious studies, and anthropology. In fact, there's a long history of the discussion here at UCSB. So Ninian Smart, who taught in our religious studies department for over 20 years, was a leading advocate of studying religions and as worldviews. And Mark Juergensmeyer, who is present here in this Zoom meeting, and who's emeritus now, but had appointments in global studies, sociology, and religious studies, also took a worldviews approach. And his approach was influenced not only by Ninian Smart, but also by Max Weber. So, and I'll come back to differences that we have in terms of how we're approaching it as the talk unfolds. But the other thing that I want to stress, and this I think particularly relevant for global studies, is that talk of worldviews is coming up in all kinds of global conversations among both scholars and activists. And some of those conversations or uses of it have to do with religion, but some don't at all. So, for example, in the United Kingdom and parts of Europe, educators are reconceptualizing religious education, which they've long taught in public schools, as the study of religions and worldviews in response to the growing secularization and religious diversity of their students. The concept is also being used in science education, where educators are trying to distinguish between scientific and what they would call pseudoscientific worldviews. And religion often winds up lurking in the background of what they consider pseudoscientific. But we also see it being used in relation to a wide range of global issues, including political polarization, climate change, and sustainable development. So while there is and has been a lot of discussion or use of the concept, I think that we need to do more work on the conceptual issues surrounding it if we want to make worldview studies or worldview analysis into a useful analytic tool. So that's the goal that I set for this talk, is to address some of the key conceptual issues under three headings: definitional issues, theoretical issues, issues having to do with elaborating the concept, and application. So the definitional question is just very basic. How should we define worldviews? And then the theoretical issues have to do with elaborating on this definition so that it's more analytically useful, both in terms of teaching and research. And in terms of application, considering how we can use this type of analysis to understand both historical and contemporary developments. So in addressing these conceptual issues, I want to make three main points. The first is that I think we've been approaching worldviews the wrong way. We've been approaching it from the top down, from the most developed forms of worldview, instead of from the bottom up. So what this has meant, I think, is that the rationalized, systematized worldviews, the ones that are most rationalized, most systematized, whether those are philosophical, religious, or ideological, are taken as the prototype of what we mean by worldview. And I'm going to be I'm going to be reframing things so that we think of them as the exception rather than the prototype. And second, to understand the multi-layered complexity of the multiple worlds that we inhabit, I think we need to think about world making as an evolved capacity that enables, that allows us to perform goal-directed actions. And then third, I'm arguing that to understand how we create, maintain, and negotiate between multiple worlds, we need better tools. And that the kind of discipline-specific tools that actually rely on what I would call world-defining concepts, such as we get when we start with religion, politics, or ideology, I don't think that those disciplinary concepts are really up to the task. So I want to begin by looking at the definitional issues and consider what I think we need in a good definition. So first of all, I think we need a way of understanding worldviews that works across disciplines, one that's not discipline specific or bound by some particular intellectual domain. So sorry about this for those who have a stake in it. This is why I think we should not define worldviews using terms borrowed from religious studies, such as myth, ritual, or doctrine, which is how Ninian Smart and others defined worldviews. Because I think that overly privileges or unfairly privileges religious worldviews over secular ones. And one of the things that we really need to be able to do at this point is analyze secular as well as religious worldviews. Second thing that I think we need is a definition that works for everyone, that is not culture bound. For many in the humanities, I know this sounds like a tall order because we tend to think everything is culture bound. But in defining worldviews, Egil Asprem, who I've been collaborating with on this, we've been building on scholarship introduced by the Worldviews Research Group in Belgium, and then further refined by anthropologist Andre Droogers, who's emeritus at the Free University in the Netherlands. And they define worldviews in terms of big questions. And I'll get to the specific questions in a few slides. But these are big questions that they contend, and we agree, that all humans have to answer. And these include, just generally speaking, questions such as, what is reality as I know it? What's the situation in which I find myself? And what goal shall I pursue? But it's really important in thinking about them defining worldviews in terms of big questions, that the big questions are not necessarily ultimate questions. Max Weber defined worldviews in terms of ultimate questions. But Egil and I think that this is also a problem, since again, it focuses our attention on the more highly systematized and rationalized worldviews, which may actually introduce the kind of cultural biases we're trying to avoid. That doesn't mean that we're not interested in how people might answer ultimate questions, but that's a subset. So why do we think that the big questions, broadly construed, are pan-human or not culture bound? So our confidence in this regard is premised on the conviction that the need to answer these questions is embedded in our evolutionary history, because not only humans, but other animals as well, have to answer these questions, at least implicitly, not verbally, in order to take goal-directed action. So humans obviously can go beyond implicit answers to these kinds of questions, to ask the questions, to verbalize the questions, and to reflect on their answers to the questions. But implicit answers, we would argue, are embedded in our ways of life, whether we reflect on them or not. So the argument that we're making is premised on a distinction between the worlds that humans and other animals perceive or create through the ways that they perceive the environment. And the environment, we would argue, exists independent of our perceptions. But worlds, in the way that I'm using it here, is dependent, is perception dependent, and therefore depends on the way the organism has evolved to perceive the environment. So given this distinction between world and environment, we can think of humans and other animals as world makers. And William Payden, scholar of religion, made a great point quite a while ago, actually in the 80s. And this quote I really love, so I'm just going to read this one to you. He wrote that in the broadest sense, there are as many worlds as there are species. All living things select and sense the way things are through their own organs and modes of activity. They constellate the environment in terms of their own needs, sensory system, and values. They see or smell or feel what they need to, and everything else may as well not exist. A world of whatever set of creatures is defined by this double process of selection and exclusion. So when organisms, as he says, sense the way things are, they're making sense, so to speak, of events in their environment. If you're a very basic sort of organism, you have to determine whether something is food or whether it's poison, whether you should take it in or move away from it. Humans, I'm suggesting, are highly evolved, meaning-making animals that naturally pursue value-laden goals in concert with others. So with our highly developed skills, we can go way beyond answering basic questions about ourselves, our environment, and our goals. We can articulate our answers, we can recount them in stories, we can pass them on to our children, and we can build social organizations to promote them. And we don't necessarily agree on our answers. We know this full well. We can debate them, we can try to convince others, we can try to force them to adopt our answers, and we can go to war to defend them. So humans create diverse, often conflictual cultural worlds defined by tacit agreements regarding identity, meaning, and purpose. So let's look now at the big questions loosely adapted from the Worldviews research group. So they start with an ontology question. What exists? What's real? A cosmology question. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? An epistemology question. How do we know these things? An anthropology question. What is the situation in which we find ourselves? An axiology question. What is the good or the goal that we should strive for? And finally, a praxeology question. What action should we take? What path should we follow? These questions, with their nifty traditional philosophical labels, I admit, make it hard to think that not only humans, but other animals might have to answer these questions. So I realize that sounds a little implausible when we look at them formulated this way. Eggles and my breakthrough on this issue, however, came when we realized that we could express the questions in general biological terms using the language of predictive processing, which is increasingly being used by biologists and neuroscientists in order to talk about how we process information. I've, in context where I'm doing a whole series of lectures on worldview stuff, I've devoted an entire lecture to elaborating the point. So I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse here of how we've done this. I'm going to give you one slide from that much larger lecture, and we can come back to this issue if you want in the Q&A. So here's the chart that shows how we translate the big questions into general biological terms. The main thing that I want to highlight is that viewed from an evolutionary perspective, everything revolves around the praxeology question. That is the question of how the organism should act in any given situation. The question, the praxeology question, presupposes various options. It presupposes various competing goals. Should I move away? Should I move toward? The goals compete for primacy, for the ability to direct the organism's action. And the organism chooses an action based on its evaluation of incoming information, its evaluation of the current situation relative to its goal. Now, obviously, this isn't occurring reflectively. It's occurring in an using evolved mechanisms that to an outsider may look pretty automatic. So the organism is evaluating the incoming information about its current situation, about the environment in relationship to a goal, and in relation to the values that are in effect built into its evolved structure. And so how in the end does the organism know if its appraisal of the situation is correct? Well, organisms don't survive and reproduce if they don't assess their situation correctly. So again, that's built into the evolutionary process. So what we're contending is that as evolved animals, goal-directed action is the bottom line for us too. And from this evolutionary perspective, we can see that we've built up, a variety of layers. If we look at very simple organisms and then increasingly more complex organism, look at what mammals can do, look at what primates can do, look at what we can do, look at what octopuses can do. We can see lots of ways that these questions get asked in more and more complicated ways. So from this evolutionary vantage point, our religions, philosophies, and ideologies become these highly elaborated, systematized, and rationalized attempts to depict our world and the way that at least some parties think we should behave in it. The key point I want to make here is that most of the time, most humans don't think or act based on explicit, rationalized, consistent answers to these questions. Moreover, few humans live within a single homogeneous world. Most of us navigate within and between multiple worlds that are nested within each other in complicated ways, and which, as Jan was raising at the beginning, we argue about how they should be nested within each other. And Our ability to do all this, we're arguing, is built on world-making capacities, some of which we share with other animals and that are therefore operative within and along with the more higher human-specific abilities that we possess. So this is all a case for why I think we need better tools, why we need to refine our understanding of the variety of ways in which we can express answers to the big questions, if we want to have tools that are adequate to analyzing what's going on with the worldviews that we embrace. So that brings me to the theoretical elaboration part of this talk. And I'm going to talk about 3 ways that we can elaborate. First is in terms of modes of worldview expression. So the modes idea is going to indicate the degree to which the answers to the questions are made explicit. The second is scale of worldview expression, which is going to indicate who or for whom the researcher is answering the big questions. And the third is scope of worldview expression, which indicates the extent to which the answers to the questions shift between situations. So let's start with the modes. So answers to the big questions can be enacted in practice. They're embedded in a way of life. In that kind of situation, they're mostly taken for granted. They're generally learned informally, and they don't necessarily cohere. So they may be episodic, they may be fragmented. Articulated worldviews are answers to the questions that are expressed in words. What is said may or may not reflect the enacted answers to the questions. Articulation of answers enables people to offer justifications for their behavior. Answers can also be memorized and recounted orally. This enables more formal teaching, and it empowers specialists who may be designated to memorize and recount. And finally, we have textualized worldviews that are preserved in writing. Textualizing enables commentary, and this also enables systemization and rationalization. So I want to stress in looking at this full screen here that although it's possible to view these forms of expression developmentally, I want to emphasize that these are all present in literate cultures and that they build on and do not replace each other. Not only that, they're always interacting. And I think this is part of what makes the analysis of worldview dynamics so complex. So now let's turn to the scale of analysis, which can range from macro to micro. If we define the micro level in terms of individuals, we can think of individuals as embedded in progressively larger groups of people. And that's what you see in the pink on the left. But if we think of humans as a species, they can be nested in progressively larger groups of animals, as you see in the purple on the right. And different things stand out when we analyze ways of life at different scales. Compared to the other great apes, the common human ability to develop, enact, and transmit very different ways of life stands out. If we focus on humans, the differences between human ways of life may stand out. If we focus on individuals, the differences within a community or culture will likely stand out. Comparisons and thus similarities and differences are always at a particular scale of analysis. The important thing to recognize is whatever scale we select as researchers, it will enable us to see some things and obscure others. It's also crucial to recognize that individuals may belong to more than one family and identify with more than one group. And this takes us to the question of scope. Scope, as I indicated a little bit ago, refers to the extent to which the answers to the question shift between situations. Who we say we are and the goals we seek to pursue often shift based on our context. We can think of the range of contexts in which a given set of answers are possible and permitted as matters of scope. When I go to visit people in some other country, certain things, ways that I would answer the questions might shift, and certain kinds of responses would be seen as appropriate or permitted in that context that might not be permitted in another context. Ideas of possibility and permission obviously involve issues of custom, power, and authority that are part of the dynamics within and between groups. So here's some of the options that I could see for scope. We could have categories that are overlapping or merged. So any kind of hyphenated identities such as African American or Jewish American might be overlapping or merged categories. We can have distinct but compatible identities, such as dual citizenship. We can have distinct and incompatible identities, such as Christian and atheist. And if we think of identities as roles, we can also consider the possibility of role-specific answers. The umpire has a different role than the players, and thus different goals. But the umpire can shift roles and play the game. Similarly, my goals shift when I'm in my academic scholar role compared to when I'm in an activist or advocacy role. So all of these aspects of scope, modes, and scale can be in play when we analyze worldview dynamics. So the first thing that I want to suggest here is that analyzing a worldview isn't the same as analyzing worldview dynamics. When we analyze answers to the big questions at a given point in time, as expressed as at a specific scale in a particular mode, we're taking a snapshot, as if we're looking at a single frame in a movie. We can compare snapshots to analyze similarities and differences, but they don't capture change or the dynamics of change. So worldview dynamics looks at change over time. And we can think of dynamics in two broad ways, depending on whether we're focusing on a system, that is a set of answers, or the goal-directed actions of an individual or a group. In computational modeling terms, which is something that I'm aspiring to be able to do, we can think of this in terms of systemic and agent-based models. So a systemic analysis would view the big questions as a set of interconnected components that allow us to consider how the system changes in response to changes in input. And an agent-based approach would view the big questions as a framework for goal-directed action which would allow us to consider what emerges from interactions at various levels. So this takes me to the last bit of this talk, where I want to talk briefly and in a pretty sketchy fashion about two kinds of applications. In my own research, on the identify shifts, doing this for particular cases has helped me to identify processes that may be more generalizable. And so down the road, I'm planning, hoping to work with friends who have expertise in computer modeling and simulations to see if we can begin to model some of those dynamics. But to wrap up this talk, I can briefly illustrate how I used the big questions in my historical work on the emergence of Alcoholics Anonymous. In case you're not that familiar with it, Alcoholics Anonymous is a spiritually based self-help movement that emerged out of the explicitly Protestant Christian Oxford group movement. And as a result of its origins, historians both inside and outside of AA have argued over the extent to which AA actually broke with its Protestant origins. And I've used formal statements. So this is a statement right now I'm giving you about the scale of analysis. I've used formal statements from each of the organizations to identify how each group would have answered the big questions at a particular point in time. So this chart, again, is taken from one of my talks. And what you see here are the big questions on the left column, the Oxford group's answers in the middle column, and AA's answers in the right-hand column. So what I have here for the Oxford group and Alcoholics Anonymous are what I would call group level snapshots. And comparing them gives us some sense of similarities and differences between how they'd answer the questions, but it doesn't suggest or indicate what factors might have produced the differences. Looking at the process developmentally in light of historical sources, I would argue that the precipitating factor that led to the emergence of AA as a separate group grew out of the practice that you see down here in the bottom row. It's part of their path to the goal. You'll see that both groups share stories and seek guidance. In one case from God, in the other case from a higher power or power greater than ourselves. So they both have this practice of seeking guidance from a higher source. And most specifically, I would argue that their split was precipitated from disagreements within the Oxford group, where Bill Wilson, who became the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, disagreed with his group with respect to how God was guiding him. So Bill Wilson thought God was guiding him to save other drunks, whereas his Oxford group thought God was guiding him to save sinners, generally, whether they were alcoholics or not. He left the group, or depending on which account you read, was kicked out over this issue, which was basically a disagreement over identity, over who the we that constitutes the group should be, whether it should be drunks or sinners. So based on this additional information, I would argue that AA's answers to the other big questions, the others in addition to the who are we question, shifted in response to their decision to include any alcoholic who wanted to stop drinking. So that their inclusive understanding of membership is what led them to articulate their spiritual path as generically as they could, which then further distinguished AA from the explicit Christianity of the Oxford group. So if we were creating a model of this, we could think of a shift in identity as an input variable whose weight could be adjusted to determine how it affected the other answers to the big questions. The model would have to be a lot more complex than that, but I'm just trying to give you a very rough sketch given my limited sense of all this right now. Modeling, that is. Anyway, to shift gears, if we view the big questions as a framework for goal-directed action, we can consider what emerges from interactions at various levels. So here's another of these charts. And this chart or table I created using stories that Bill Wilson told about himself and generalized to some degree based on stories that others in AA told about themselves. And the columns here, the big questions are again on the left, but the second and third columns, where it has alcoholic enacted and alcoholic articulated, are two modes of alcoholic agent-based analysis. And the column on the right is for our answers for a recovering alcoholic in Alcoholics Anonymous. So what I found really interesting when I set things up this way is that having the modes of analysis highlighted the internal conflict between the alcoholic's enacted and articulated goals. So the alcoholic's articulated action or articulated goal was to drink less and abstain or totally abstain from drinking. But their enacted goal was to get drunk. So there was clearly a conflict here. And Bill Wilson actually tells a story about how one goal, how after just recounting to a friend his goal of not drinking anymore, somebody pushed a drink his direction and he just started drinking it and got totally ripped again. So this sense that these goals are competing and they can shift very quickly. The other thing that became clear in doing this, as I asked the how do we know this question, is that I realized that there was an underlying learned cultural schema that was, in effect, how Bill Wilson knew that he could use willpower and good intentions to reach his goal of drinking less. And so it's this tacit cultural schema that I think was tacitly governing his response. And this schema depicts an ideal self as an autonomous and self-controlled self, and willpower as an effective means of achieving one's goals. AA's 12 steps, that's its spiritual path, are explicitly premised on relinquishing this autonomous self schema and explicitly relying on a power greater than oneself, including the power of the group, in order to recover from alcoholism. But we know that not all cultures view the self in this way. And this is one of the big findings of cultural psychology, for example. And they differ too with respect to the cultural practices that surround drinking. So given this, I'm imagining that we could create an agent-based computer model that would compare levels of alcoholism and the growth of AA in relation to differing cultural conceptions of self. And I would predict that both alcoholism and AA groups would be more prevalent in cultures that place a premium on autonomy. So, to wrap all this up here, returning to the idea of the big questions as tools, I've been talking about them as analytic tools that allow us to refine our descriptions of worldviews by illuminating aspects of worldviews and ways of life. And in that context, I talked about modes of expression, scale of expression, which, as we just saw, Bill Wilson's enacted answers are what we could call subpersonal, and his articulated would be personal. And then also scope of expression, whether overlapping, distinct, etc. But in this last section, where I've been talking about how it might be possible to develop computer models and simulations in relation to the dynamics of how these components interact, we can start to see how the big questions could be used, or this kind of worldview analysis could be used as explanatory tools, and the big questions viewed as components that interact to produce worldviews and ways of life. And so I've been talking then about two ways that we can think about this. We can view them systemically as interconnected components and consider how the system changes in response to changes in input. And we can look at them from an agent-based perspective in terms of viewing them as frameworks for goal-directed action and consider what emerges as various goals at different levels compete for primacy. So last slide here. This last slide is actually taken from my why we should think of religions as worldview and ways of life talk. And so this is my list of key advantages of taking a big questions approach. First of all, that it includes all of us. So it includes secular, political, and religious worldviews, as well as ways of life where none of those domains or conceptual domains necessarily exist. Where's my go? Okay. Second, it's even-handed. So the big questions give us an even-handed basis for comparison that doesn't privilege one worldview over another, one way of life over another. I've made a big case here, or tried to, that this is even-handed because they're based on evolutionary processes that are pan-human. And we can use these big questions to analyze any situation, including our own, in any mode and at any scale. We can use them as tools for academic research or in applied context to support various activist agendas. And We can use them by not starting by defining religions or defining ideologies or defining politics. We can use these generic big questions to analyze how people position themselves and interact with others, including the role that these markers of identity, religious, ethnic, racial, political, secular, or sexual, whatever, play in constituting groups and in creating the dynamics that set up both tensions and modes of cooperation within larger groups. So that's it. Thank you. These are pictures of a couple people I've collaborated with and the publications that we've been publishing on this that would allow you to get back to some of the evolutionary stuff and some of the religious studies stuff if you want to.
And thanks so much. Mark, I see a question. Thanks very much. And please, Mark.
Sure. Thank you, Anne. This is terrific. And it follows up very much on some of the thinking that we talked about 5 years ago when we were part of the worldview analysis seminar that Mona Sheikh and I, Mona from the Copenhagen School of the Danish Institute of International Studies, and she was a research fellow at the Orpheus Center. And we convened this seminar, and Anne has a wonderful essay, and I commend it to everyone who is a part of the group today, on which will show how she uses worldview analysis, or at least how she did several years ago, in application, particularly to Mormon Revelation, which is a really interesting study. And it's a part of a book that's now been published by Routledge called Entering Religious Minds, the Social Study of Worldviews. And it's intended to be, Routledge has priced it very cheaply. It's intended to be a kind of how-to book. Hey, there you go. Anne has one of the first essays in that book. You open it and read her essay. And it's intended to be a kind of guidebook for anybody doing worldview analysis, how to do it with examples of how people have done it. And then particularly in the essays that I've done with Mona on just practical hints on how to go about it. So in general, I agree with most of what you've said. And I guess my main, particularly the whole idea of modes and shades of expression, I think that's very helpful in thinking about worldviews that are bigger than a breadbasket or large as the universe, because it's a very queasy thing to get a handle on. And I appreciate your attempt to try to create big questions as a way of helping us define what a worldview is. My main problem is that you began talking about wanting to look at worldviews from the bottom up rather than top down. I can't imagine anything more top down than a group of academics deciding what the big questions are and then applying it to all kinds of worldviews. That seems to me problematic. I mean, these are questions that we ask, but whether these would be the ones that define worldviews for the actors, particularly of other species, for example, that's a tougher sell. I mean, my own approach to this, as you probably know, beginning with my presidential speech at the AAR some 10 years ago, and then in a book that I did with Craig Calhoun on exploring reimagining secularism, rethinking secularism, where we looked at secularism as a worldview. And then in this recent book, that collaborative book that I did with you and with Mona and with others, I use not Weber, as you said, but more Foucault and Foucault's discussion of the episteme. And so when I talked about worldviews in these earlier articles, I talked about it as epistemic worldviews, using Foucault's notion of an episteme. And what I liked about that was this is a kind of undergirding logic that holds everything together. These are the big questions that you're talking about, but not deciding what the big questions are, but to say that for anyone, there is a coherence, a logical coherence that makes the world work. And then in a social context, I merged this with the kind of social construction of analysis school within sociology that for years has been looking at the way in which reality is socially constructed and how, to a termite looking at a table, it's an edible feast. To us, it's maybe a desk. To a priest, it may be an altar. The same object is socially constructed. It looks different from different angles. So that's my attempt to try to put together epistemic worldview analysis with social construction of reality. And then to try to work at, and it seems to me the only way you can figure it out is to get to know your subjects, or to get to know, if it's other species, get to know as much about them as you can. To study animal behavior, for example, to try to, this wonderful book on dogs that this woman at Columbia University has done recently, that really tries to get inside the mind of a dog. It's, these people we live with all the time. But to get to understand their worldviews, it seems to me that that's the real task of worldview analysis, of entering, as we put in our book, entering religious minds. Yeah, taking those big questions that you have, but also be willing to alter, change them when you begin to see the world other people see them. And that's been my task in all of the research I've done. As you know, I've studied terrorists. That's the reason why I got involved in this worldview analysis and trying to understand the world of people who are so different from me and who can use violence so easily. What makes that make sense? And to try to make sense of that means to do exactly what you're talking about, to try to enter into the worldview of another person in a way to see how their logic coheres, their episteme in Foucaultian terms, allows those actions to make sense in a way that to me are totally nonsensical. So we're on the same wavelength, Anne, but I do wonder about the utility of the big questions, other than it guides us. It helps us begin to move into what is a real task of worldview analysis, and that's entering into other worlds and entering into the worldview of other perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I guess I'm thinking of two responses, which is, first of all, I definitely do find the questions a helpful starting point in terms of moving into how other humans or other organisms understand their worlds. But we are making a stronger argument, which I definitely hear you resisting. So I tried to be really clear that I didn't think that other animals were reflecting on these questions. I don't think they have the capacity to either, in most cases, as far as I know, either reflect on them or explicitly ask them. What we're arguing is that they have to be answered in a way that's appropriate to the evolved nature of the organism in order for it to survive. So in that sense, we don't think that these are arbitrary questions. We think these questions are built into that evolutionary process. In that longer lecture on the evolutionary foundations of worldviews that I alluded to, I specifically took the case of a one-celled, light-sensitive organism to answer the big, to tease out how it would be answering the big questions. So in effect, to enter into its so-called mind, not a very, complicated mind, but it has to have certain kinds of light receptors that it uses to determine what's happening with the intensity of light in its environment and decide if it should move toward the light or move away from the light. And so, you know, it's not a super complicated mind, but that was kind of a test for me to see if the questions could work on that kind of level.
Overlapping with this, and simply what is open, folks, to come in with some. Say, I'm thinking, and Mark, I'm thinking one about phenomenology, Husserl's work, which then leads into this social construction of reality that you're referring to, Mark. I'm also thinking of anthropology, has been studying this all along. And fairly recent discussion has been the cosmovisions that social movements in Latin America said, no, don't want just this goal. We have a vision that, such as the Zapatistas that we think of. Then there's also links with, of course, with cognitive science, neuroscience, and I think, or where I am in global studies, is narrative analysis is profoundly important, because globalization is not just an intersection, a universe of many probabilities, but is also a salad bowl of stories, storylines. Think of evolutionary survival, think of COVID-19. How is COVID-19 handled? What different worldviews give rise to what strategic dilemmas, both from a system point of view and an agent point of view, and the perplexities that drive or paralyze action are 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 tremendous, and their comparative data are at our fingertips, and not just the data, but worldviews that drive them, underline them, undergird them. And these worldviews, some are enabling and some are disabling. And how we rank them. So I think if listening to you, and what I want to do is industrial espionage in global studies, what can we learn from your refined, clearly mapped, multidimensional mapping exercise? We must learn this. I think it is a fascinating overview. Okay, that is just a remark, and
Well, before Anne answers, let me just undergird what you just said, and that is the importance of worldview analysis for global studies. It seems to me that our field is deliberately interdisciplinary, deliberately trying to move beyond cultural boundaries, deliberately trying to avoid taking a unidimensional approach, deliberately trying not to implant a Western frame of knowledge on everything else. We just intuitively do worldview analysis, which is why I think it's wonderfully appropriate to have Anne discuss this with us today. And there's much to learn from her and from the variety of people who are working on worldview analysis, which I think is kind of the central, or maybe I would say the central paradigm for understanding global studies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that's why I kind of wanted to, venture out to talk about it as an analytical method, and which is, where obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but for me, I've been trying to bridge to the sciences for a long time. So I'm trying to bring in more of the cognitive and the evolutionary, and not to understand the process of differentiation and social construction, not as an either or. And I think this distinction between worlds as perceived and an environment that just is what it is, independent of how we perceive it, is a really important distinction. So there's a sense that our perceptions are both species specific, but also much more situation specific, which, Jan, gets back to what you were talking about in COVID. Since the election, since 2016, as I could manage to try and take an academic view of our political situation, I've really been struck by the importance of the situation, what I sometimes call the anthropology question, but for shorthand, the situation question. What is the situation in which we find ourselves? Because it seems to me that the way people answer that question varies widely. And a lot of times we're just not attuned to how different the situation can be perceived. So when you're talking about responses to COVID, what is the world in which people are operating and where they're getting their information about the situation in which we find ourselves? And to what extent are they believing Trump, who's telling him it's going to go away soon, it's no big deal, I got out of the hospital, don't worry about it. And then Biden raises the possibility, but have people died in your family? So that there may be a conflict there for somebody who wants to believe Trump, but maybe they've got behaviorally in their world things that don't fit. So they have cognitive dissonance, or, so all those factors are going into how they perceive the situation, which is then going to impact not only what they think the goal should be, but how they think we ought to get there.
And if I may add something to this, take the situation of Israel. Israel needs to control quote, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Jews, West Jerusalem, follow a different path, and their group that they are part is of Benjamin Netanyahu government. So the rabbinical court that is to decide on this does not take a decision, does not condemn their resistance of this group to containment. We have a similar situation in Brooklyn, in New York City. So there's a perplexity in government and in governance that makes the situation insoluble. Now, there is an impasse. And this kind of impasse ranges across many different situations. And part of the situation from an evolutionary point of view is collective learning. East Asia has experienced SARS, MERS, infectious diseases, is well prepared. The public is well organized. Government is well organized. They can act. Others with African countries with Ebola, HIV experience can act. Many other countries find them at this kind of impasse. And when we come to the vaccine stage, there are many other impasses that emerge. Analysis, is adjacent to a narrative analysis, which is adjacent to a governance analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this is agent and systems.
Yeah.
They overlap. So there are intersecting probabilities here, and at the same time, our species futures are at
Mm-hmm.
stake. Our world, our global coexistence is on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've been trying to use narrative analysis to approach global coexistence as a salad bowl of storylines.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to learn from your approach, and I want to revisit rights, etc. What is useful to bring us further, also in global studies and in action dilemma like 19. And we are all at these dilemmas and perplexities, meaning all the species. And as you, there is an sich and für sich, and the virus is an sich and for us consciously are the dynamics of cognition. I'm not sure the question, but please, other people, would you like to come in with a comment or a question?
Oh, Mark, I see your comment. Sorry. I thought you had retired. Maybe I was projecting. You're muted.
Yeah, I move in that
Jan,
direction, Anne, but I'm not there yet.
yeah. Okay. My apologies. Don't want to prematurely precipitate anything. Jan, as you were talking, if you want, I'll go back to a couple of things you said.
Yes, please, because I don't see other questions yet.
Okay.
Floor is open.
So when you were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, it brought to mind the work of Scott Atran and some others. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes.
But it kind of fits too with Mark's emphasis on, entering religious minds, because I think part of what his work really highlights for me anyway is the role of sacralization of land and, certain, the temple and other aspects of the physical environment in ways that are built into their differing views of reality, of what is and what's real, and probably built in through stories, like you're saying, but that make negotiations, practically impossible for negotiators who are just thinking in the kind of rational terms that would think, this has nothing to do with sacrality. And creating land or spaces that aren't open to negotiations in terms of money or division or any of the usual kinds of negotiating tactics.
And thinking about your overview, I think, say, the multiple views, it concerns all of us, all of that is relatively easy. The most vulnerable one is even-handed. The acceptance on the part of multiple parties that this even, that's a vulnerable point. Also between the Oxford group and the founder, it's the even-handed. There lies the problem.
So what do you mean by that? That whether we as researchers can be even-handed in our approach, whether the people that we're, say, talking to, if we're doing this ethnographically, would perceive the questions as even-handed?
The idea on the part of actors that their worldview, cognition, analysis, perspective is as important as that of secular Jews, or Muslims in France. Their view is as important as that of the secular French, who thinks that the cartoons of Mohammed are entertaining and so forth.
Yeah, well, okay, I think we need to distinguish between a research methodology that is even-handed and what the people that we're working with and trying to understand their views. I mean, in the Revelatory Events book that you put on the flyer, I was comparing the emergence of 3 different groups: Mormons, Alcoholics Anonymous, and this new age type group called that around A Course in Miracles. And 2 of them, the other 2, not AA, pretty much saw themselves as the one true path. And so they didn't value each of the others even-handedly. And some of them, you know, even kind of complained to me about, you know, the way that I was doing things. But when I explained to them that, look, I'm dealing with all 3 of these groups. And so, you know, I'm not going to take sides with any one of you. Then they could kind of realize why I was distancing myself somewhat from their point of view. I wasn't just echoing their point of view. At the same time, I wasn't rejecting it or disclaiming it, but, you know, I was stepping back.
Please, and thanks. Among others, I see our time, we have 10 minutes, maybe a few minutes longer. Please, other people who want to come in and join the conversation. Because if we go back to Foucault, every truth claim is a power claim. And every truth. So the moment you say that, you take power out of the equation. I see here William Bradley. William, do you want to come in?
I have to leave very soon because I was going to attend another talk. But thank you so much for the great talk. I really enjoyed it.
We have Zoom addiction, Bill.
What?
Zoom addiction.
Zoom addiction. Yes, I know. the next
serfdom.
talk is in Hawaii. Here I am in Japan, and it's 5 in the morning.
Oh dear.
Oh my dear.
Only half awake here, but yeah.
All right, Bill.
Good
to see you.
And thank you very much for the talk. I enjoyed it. Yes. And good
Okay.
also to see Mark as well. I haven't seen either you or Jan since Leipzig.
All right.
I'll probably try to attend in next week, or if I can get up early in the morning.
Courage. All right. So power is a big part of the equation. The moment you say even-handed, you place yourself outside of the epistem. But so there's an outside from an analysis point of view, but is outside from, shall we say it, an evolutionary point of view, because we participate in this. If we take COVID, what is the outside? The outside is a study.
Yeah. So to me, this is the part about shifting roles that I would see as part of the kind of scope of our analysis. So if we're doing an academic study, we can argue about what the ground rules are, what the values are, what the goals are. But I think that one of the goals that many of us would embrace would be to try and be even-handed, and that we would make a distinction between advocacy work and more even-handed academic work. At least coming out of religious studies, that's one of the distinctions we make between doing theology, which would be, advocating a theological point of view, versus studying different religious traditions even-handedly. So my own sense may be fairly shaped by that kind of distinction. But totally, I think we can move into whatever mode you want to call it, our advocacy mode, our politically embedded mode, and we can then answer the questions or advocate for we can talk about the situation as we see it. So it's not just about how other people see it. Often in my academic work, I'm trying to understand other people's minds, but we can always shift into what, our view of the situation.
Right, and I think that's critical, because what we're doing is a kind of translation, in that we never stand outside of worldviews. We're in our own worldview. That's something that we pushed in Craig Calhoun and I in the book on rethinking secularism, because often, religion is studied by people who think they're outside. Well, they're in something. We're all in something. So it's a matter of translating from one worldview to another.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, I lost you a bit. Ricardo,
from the perspective of our worldview.
Yeah. Ricardo, do you want to come in? Or Amy? Or Colin? All right. Say, in development studies, we distinguish between an actor-oriented approach and a system or a structure-oriented approach.
Yeah.
You take an actor-oriented, and dealing with COVID, we are all actors. We can put on a mask or refuse to do so, etc., etc. We can be inside or right, and so.
Yeah.
We're all in this.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of what was bugging me about what's going on in religious studies. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of times, as I would be teaching like a general education course, there'd be a lot of fairly secular kids in the class. So it'd be like, we're studying other people. We're not in the picture if we're more secularly oriented. Once I changed my lower division course to comparing religions and other worldviews, I could put in humanism. And then I had a tradition that was representing, people that would not generally consider themselves religious. And it was much more inclusive. And religious studies scholars are now increasingly studying secularism. And this was what precipitated me getting into this worldview stuff, because it was just kind of absurd for me to see scholars of religion studying secularism and still calling it religious studies. I mean, it was like I felt like we have to break down and go for a bigger kind of umbrella or framework, which I think you guys, much more automatically trying to do global studies.
Yeah, and when Ninian Smart years ago proposed worldview analysis, he suggested that departments of religious studies be renamed departments of worldview and ideological studies.
Yeah. Well,
look, folks, there is now a drama unfolding in France and in Paris. Laicité, secularism, Muslim views. And if we now combine this with even-handedness, if the French laicité government advocates take the position, oh, the Muslims, they are on an even level, and it would be a good idea on our part to not spend so much time to insult them and mock them, because we cannot imagine that in Tehran there would be a cartoon contest for satirizing Jesus or the Buddha. So that is civilizationally, it is not done, right? Free speech exists only on the mountaintop. So it is that lack of restraint, it's that lack of even-handedness on the part of secularists that is causing this problem. And instead of recognizing the importance of restraint from a civilizational evolutionary point of view, they are doubling down, which escalates the situation. Are we on a page?
Well, I guess for starters, it might be good to analyze, the worldviews of some of the key actors or in that conflict, to try and understand more why they're doing what they're doing. Because, why would the secularists do things that they know would inflame Muslims in France? There may be a value there. I'm not sure what it is, but around free speech or freedom of the press or something like that, that they're holding up and valuing far more than, say, the Muslims who are offended would be. And it may be that highlighting some of those differences and differences in values, and potentially maybe being able to talk about them in a more safe and contained environment. There's been some experiments along those lines with representatives of our different polarized groups. And so I don't know, all this stuff I find pretty hard. And in this current situation, sometimes I just feel like hopeless, and it's hard to.
If we would adopt a conflict resolution kind of perspective and orientation, then in global studies, conflict resolution and recognition of civilizational boundaries, what you call even-handedness, would come in. But the global situation is one of gradients of power. Power is everywhere. It's in the equation. We cannot simply clinically scrap it out. And so there are power games and power dramas happening of a staggering kind, involving the fates of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So we are not doing some kind of extraterrestrial chess game. We are in it. And because we are in it and we are engaged, these perplexities that are universally shared, they are ours.
And I think you may be extending the value of even-handedness further than I meant it, because I primarily it was primarily relative to the issue that Mark raised. that I really think that that the big questions that we're talking about are questions that aren't privileging one group over another, and in that sense are even-handed questions. It may be that in some contexts they haven't been reflected on, but we can look at people's behavior and we can talk to them about that. So that's the level where I'd want to argue with Mark more about whether or not those questions are culturally biased versus even-handed. So, but in terms of all the others, what stance we take, because we are in the mix and we can step back a bit, but that's only, a stance. All that is pretty open to me. I mean, I don't have a particular.
So, in global studies, I now take a position I call our global course a salad bowl of stories. But this is actually a polite compromise. It's much more than a salad bowl. It is because each story, most stories are competing for power. And some stories think of the Supreme Court and Coney Barrett being elected, hinges on stories that are already structurally embedded in the rules of the Senate, and some things that go back to the late 18th, early 19th century. They're embedded, they already set parameters in which we are supposed to be functioning, even if we don't accept them, but they structure behavior. And world hegemon arrogating to itself the decision-making power to recast allies, say Muslims in the Middle East, allies during the Cold War, as new enemies. And so this constant shuffling on the part of alliances and positions. So worldviews are, some worldviews are weaponized, and others are part of a cure from story addiction processes.
Yep. No, I mean, if we look at the history of colonization and conquest and genocide, I mean, those are often fueled, by stories that are very, like religious stories about salvation and all that. And, the conquest is good for you.
There's God on our side.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, I'm not trying to overlook the power dynamics there. I mean, I think it's all infused through it.
Yeah, and I think we should sympathize with God, who complains about doing overwork.
Yeah.
All right, say marvelous. Please, I see some thanks here, Amy and others. This is so wonderful an engagement and a conversation, and thank you so much. Thank you all for participating. Brett, thanks for orchestrating all of us. Thanks a lot. Is it okay? And this is recorded, right, Brett? And we can post this. Is that okay, Anne?
Yeah, that's
all right.
Fine.
Super. I look forward to reviewing it. Thanks very much. Applause.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Nice
Cheers,
to
Anne.
see you, Colin and Joni.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Brett, over to you.
Yep. Thanks,
So I'm
everybody.
going to sign off.
Yep.
Yes. All right. We can. All right. Thanks.